World of Warcraft has known many specs and variations of those specs throughout its 15-year lifespan. From specs that were a complete joke in the beginning of the game, to specs where people complained that they were way too powerful. Today we're going to dive into a couple of these specs that I deem to be my favorite. Keep in mind that these aren't necessarily the best specs, that I'll only talk about specs that I played myself and that they are in no particular order. So without further ado, let's get started. And we're starting off the list with a true classic, no pun intended, and that is the Elemental Shaman spec in vanilla World of Warcraft. Like the Elemental Shaman spec, there were several that had a negative stigma attached to them, as many people considered them to be not viable for raiding. So the Elemental Shamans had a bit of an uphill battle in vanilla. That, and because so many people got hung up over the idea of Wind Fury being completely overpowered, the Elemental spec was not that popular and got shoved to the sideline a bit. This, however, also created its underdog status, and anyone who put in some serious time into the spec definitely had the element of surprise at their side. Simply because people just didn't expect as much of this way of playing. It goes without saying that sooner or later, people realized that this spec was very powerful in PvP with its high burst damage, survivability, and versatility, as they could either have Elemental Mastery as their top talent, which gave them a guaranteed critical strike every 3 minutes, or Nature Swiftness, which would make their next nature spell an instant cast, so that could be used for both damage or healing. A very popular burst combo for Elemental Shamans was casting Lightning Bolt from a distance, then casting Chain Lightning, and as soon as you would finish casting Chain Lightning, the Lightning Bolt would hit the target, causing both spells to land at exactly the same time. And if one of those spells would be a crit, that would very easily amount to up to 2000 damage with the correct gear, which to some classes would mean half their health being gone in an instant. In raids they were struggling to keep up with the rest of the DPSers, so the spec was by no means perfect, but it was fun as hell to play one, and we'll get back to the spec a little later in this video. Next up we gotta talk about the Destruction Warlock in the Burning Crusade, more specifically the Firelock. This spec was a mix between Demonology and Destruction. You'd smack 21 talents in the Demonology tree to get a talent called Demonic Sacrifice, which would offer you a certain bonus depending on what pet you would sacrifice. And using this while having an Imp active would increase your fire damage by 15%. Not to mention you would also gain an extra 10% from Curse of the Elements, and if you had a Fire Mage in your group, he would add another 15% fire damage done to the target. So that is a total of 40% extra damage done to fire spells, which would stack really well with the better your gear got. This meant that the spec wasn't really that interesting if you were still wearing greens, but as soon as you got to tier 4 content and up, the crits would get pretty insane, especially if you would sacrifice a soul shard to cast Soulfire. I've had the pleasure of using this spec on my Warlock on a Burning Crusade private server, and sometimes I managed to do Soulfire crits well over 10,000 damage if I had the right buffs and my trinkets popped. The spec had a few downsides, meaning it wasn't powerful in PvP and the rotation was admittedly a little boring. But if you like big crits popping up on your screen, then this was really a good spec to roll with. Of course, if we're talking about the Firelock, we gotta talk about its shadowy counterpart, the Shadow Destro lock. This spec basically followed the same talents with a few minor changes here and there, though as the name suggests, this was all about that shadow damage. And if you thought you could do big crits with Incinerate and Conflagrate as a Firelock, you ain't seen nothing yet. Of course, like the Firelock, you'd be able to sacrifice your pet for bonus damage. Shadow Destro locks would sacrifice their Succubus for an extra 50% damage, and they also got 10% damage from the Curse of Elements. But things got a lot more crazy from here. You see, there was a talent in the Destruction tree that when you would crit with Shadow Bolt, the next 5 shadow spells would have their damage increased by another 20%. And on top of that, if you had a Shadow Priest in your group or raid, they would further increase the shadow damage done by 10% with their talent Shadow Weaving, and then another 5% with their talent Misery. The result? Well, have a look yourself. A spell that was displayed in the tooltip to do 541 to 601 damage was buffed so damn much that you could end up doing well over 5,000 Shadow Bolt crits with only a few crappy blues, and well over 9,000 Shadow Bolt crits with some raiding gear. Because of this insane damage, it ended up being a very popular spec in the Burning Crusade, and it also meant that the rotation of a Shadow Destro lock was pretty much just spamming Shadow Bolt. Just like the Firelock though, it was not as interesting as other specs in PvP, but seeing those fancy crits pop up on your screen was well worth it. Then we gotta talk about another underdog spec, which is the Balanced Druid. Though for now, we're going to talk about the Burning Crusade Balanced Druid. Like the Elemental Shaman, they had a bad rep in vanilla and also had to fight an uphill battle to prove themselves. They were shunned from raids, laughed at in PvP, and overall had a very negative stigma attached to them. This was completely changed around in the Burning Crusade era, and anyone who played a Balanced Druid in vanilla and the Burning Crusade can probably tell you just how crucial and important this change was throughout the expansion. Many Balanced Druids that dreamed about being competitive in raiding, dreamed about just being taken a little more seriously, got what they deserved in the Burning Crusade. And like the Elemental Shaman, people didn't expect much from Boomkins, right up until they got stomped on by a 4k Starfire crit in Battlegrounds, or seeing a Boomkin with good gear trounce people on the damage meters. And this is definitely why the Balanced Druid in the Burning Crusade era had to be in this video. Finally, Moomkins were taken more seriously. Though not a full 100% because the Moonkin form still looked a bit silly, but the upgraded talent trees for the Druid was definitely a step in the right direction. Then we're going to skip ahead a few expansions and go all the way to Mist of Pandaria, where we gotta talk about the Elemental Shaman again. Now, like the Balanced Druid, the Elemental Shaman underwent a lot of changes in the Burning Crusade, and they too were able to put out solid DPS, and on top of that were probably the best support class in the game. And I definitely had fun playing on a Burning Crusade private server as an Elemental Shaman. But admittedly, their rotation was very boring. If fights were very long and mana was an issue, you literally did nothing else but spam Lightning Bolt, which after a while gets pretty damn boring. And this is pretty much the main reason why I had to mention the Elemental Shaman in the Mist of Pandaria expansion. Now, while Mist of Pandaria is not exactly my favorite version of World of Warcraft, I'd be lying if I didn't have the most fun with the Elemental Shaman, with both Mastery and a talent giving you a chance to duplicate spells, the instant lava burst, and the talent Ascension, which would allow you to spam lava bursts without the cooldown for a short time. Basically, you became an absolute turret of elemental goodness, and the rotation was extremely fun, seeing all those extra spells flying at the target, crit after crit. It was one of the most fun rotations I ever played in World of Warcraft in general. Oh, and of course the chain lightning spamming for AoE packs. I felt like I was a freaking Tesla trooper from Red Alert 2, zapping targets left and right and seeing all the fancy numbers pop up on the screen. It was a good time to be an Elemental Shaman in this expansion, and yes, they weren't top DPS, but it was definitely one of my favorite specs in World of Warcraft. Next up, we gotta talk about the Mage class, cause I played that a lot too, and there were definitely some fun specs out there. Now, I thought about this, and the most fun I had with the Mage class was in vanilla, but that was with the Fire spec. You see, in the early stages of vanilla, you were forced to go Frost, as the mobs in Molten Core and Black Lair were resistant to frost damage. But after that, you were finally able to give Fire a go, and it felt really good mixing it up after doing frost damage for so long. Not only that, but the main thing that made the Fire Mage in vanilla so fun was Ignite. You see, in the Burning Crusade and up, Ignite would apply a dot to the target, and the damage over time was based on how much you did with your initial fire damage of an offensive spell. However, in vanilla, this Ignite was not your own, but shared with all the other Fire Mages in your group, which basically meant that one mage who got the first Ignite benefited from all the other Ignites that all the other mages would add to that initial one. To put it simply, this mechanic meant that the damage over time from Ignite would sometimes go well over 5,000 damage per tick, which was insane in vanilla. And if you were lucky enough to get the first initial Ignite, and you were able to not pull aggro, you would rocket yourself to the top of the DPS charts. And having that extreme bump in DPS and seeing those massive Ignite ticks was super fun. It was very volatile, as you had to be very careful with the threat, but it is no doubt the most fun I have with mages in the different expansions that I played. And then we move on to one spec that is probably the underdog of all underdogs, and that is the Smite Priest. This was a spec that barely anyone rolled with, mainly because Shadow was very powerful and even had a viable place in raiding. Smite Priests, however, were a very rare sight, which made me explore the spec in the Burning Crusade and see if it was actually viable. What I found out is that yes, this spec is absolutely viable, and I ended up pulling very respectable DPS in both dungeons and raids, often finding myself in the top 5 of the DPS when doing Karazhan or Gruels on my old Smite Priest. Though admittedly I burned through my mana fairly quickly. The rotation wasn't super complex as well, but the fact that you were there, as a priest, DPSing with holy damage, it was so quirky and definitely surprised a lot of people, which meant I had a blast playing this spec. Before we move on to the last one, I gotta give a few honorable mentions, starting with the Survival Hunter in Cataclysm, which I played on Hades WoW and I raided with for some time, and while the rotation was engaging and the DPS was good, it wasn't as fun as the ones I talked about extensively in this video. The next one is Balanced Druid in Vanilla, and while it was hard to make it viable, the rotation was literally nothing but spamming Starfire, and Balanced Druids had a negative stigma attached to them, it still had a lot of charm in my opinion, and there's a lot of fun memories of me playing a Moonkin in Vanilla World of Warcraft. Last honorable mention goes to the Elemental Shaman in Wrath of the Lich King, which was pretty awesome with the introduction of Lava Burst, though I could never really get into playing and raiding with one seriously. And then finally, we gotta talk about one more expansion and a spec that is linked to that expansion. Now if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that I have a weak spot for Balanced Druids, and I already talked about how much I liked them in the Burning Crusade era, though it was mostly due to them finally being very competitive in raiding and how their negative stigma was gone for the most part. But the actual playstyle of Boomkins themselves in raids was admittedly a little boring. First of all, they weren't too great in terms of AoE, as their main offensive ability, Hurricane, had a cooldown. That and the rotation Boomkins used was mostly just spamming Starfire, which meant that you never resorted to using Wrath, which was also one of the main offensive capabilities for Druids. So I thought long and hard about which expansion I thought they were the most fun to play, and I have to give that to the Balanced Druids in the Wrath of the Lich King era. There's two main reasons why I thought Balanced Druids were super fun in the Wrath of the Lich King era. First of all, the talent Eclipse, which made you rotate between Wrath and Starfire. So instead of just using Starfire, you now had to rotate between both offensive spells, and both the Solar and Lunar Eclipse buffed these abilities by a whole lot. My favorite one was definitely the Lunar Eclipse, which increased the critical strike chance of Starfire by 40%. Now if you had decent gear, you would see crit after crit landing on the target, resulting in you being one hell of an arcane cannon and seeing yourself skyrocket to the top of the DPS charts. The Eclipse talent was a little RNG based, but all in all it made for a super fun rotation that I absolutely loved. Another thing that was so awesome is that Boomkins were probably one of the best AoE classes in the game during that time. Hurricane no longer had a cooldown, and their last talent Starfall caused massive AoE damage. So combining Hurricane and Starfall together meant insane AoE damage and tons of crits popping up on your screen. If I had to pick a favorite out of the ones I mentioned, this would probably be number 1. Which is kind of funny considering how Wrath of the Lich King is probably my third favorite expansion in World of Warcraft, right after Vanilla and the Burning Crusade. But it is what it is. I think Boomkin in Wrath of the Lich King is super fun to play and had to be on this list without a doubt. And there you go guys, my favorite specs alongside the appropriate expansions. I know that it's only a fraction of all the crazy specs and builds that popped up during WoW's lifespan, but like I said, it's only based on what I played myself, so that's why specs from let's say Legion or Warlocks of Draenor are missing. I just never played those expansions. Anyway, I want to thank you for watching this video. I'm Hamsterwheel and have a good one.